The sky above was a storm of frozen winds and swirling snow, with no hint of warmth. Zara's body, weakened by the bitter cold of the icy planet Fralos, trembled violently. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, the frigid air freezing every exhale. She had been abandoned here, left to die by her father, the mighty King Vranak. To him, she was nothing more than a traitor, a rebellious daughter who defied his authority at every turn. He couldn't afford to let her live, not after the rebellion she had sparked within his own kingdom. Zara had once been the crown jewel of the galaxy, a powerful princess who commanded armies and influenced entire worlds. She had everything: the finest technology, the most loyal soldiers, and the most beautiful cities. But she had thrown it all away, unable to bow before a king who ruled through fear and cruelty. Her heart had longed for freedom, for a life without the heavy chains of power. But now, lying half dead on this frozen wasteland, she realized how costly her desire for liberty had been. Fralos was an unforgiving place. The planet was a vast expanse of glaciers and towering mountains, with no sign of life. Its temperature was so low that even the smallest mistake could mean death. Zara, her body bruised and broken, tried to crawl through the snow, but her limbs refused to obey. The frozen ground beneath her seemed to swallow her whole, as though it too was eager to see her vanish from existence. She had once been strong, confident, and fierce, but now, as she lay on the icy surface, her body was nothing more than a fragile shell of her former self. Her face was pale, her clothes soaked in blood, and her mind was numb. She had no idea how long she had been lying there, but it felt like an eternity. All she could hear was the howling wind, the rush of snowflakes, and the faint sound of her own heartbeat, weak, fading, and far too slow. Just as she thought her life would come to an end on this desolate world, something strange happened. The sky, dark and oppressive, split open with a flash of light, and a massive shape hurtled through the clouds. It crashed onto the icy planet with a deafening roar, sending a shockwave of energy that sent Zara tumbling through the snow. She fought to keep her eyes open, but the cold was overwhelming, and her vision blurred. She could barely make out the silhouette of a human figure emerging from the wreckage. Ethan, a soldier of Earth, had crash-landed on Fralos by accident. He had been sent on a mission, one that had gone terribly wrong. His ship, damaged in an ambush, had spiraled out of control, and now he found himself stranded on an alien planet far from home. With the cold cutting through his suit, he barely had enough time to regain his bearings. But when he spotted Zora, his heart skipped a beat. He had heard of the alien princess, the rebellious daughter of the infamous King Vranak. The stories surrounding her were filled with fear, admiration, and resentment. No one knew what had happened to her. Many assumed she was dead, a casualty of her own arrogance. Yet here she was, lying before him, as vulnerable as any other being. At first, Ethan was hesitant. She was an alien, a member of a race that had clashed with humanity for years. His mission had been to collect intel on the alien forces, not to rescue an enemy. But as he looked at her, something stirred within him. She was no different than any other human in need. She was alive, barely, and he couldn't leave her to die. Zara's breath was ragged, her vision nearly gone. She didn't know if she could trust the human before her, but in her heart, something told her he was her only chance at survival. For all her pride and defiance, she knew she couldn't survive on this planet alone. And yet she couldn't bring herself to ask for help. It wasn't just her pride that held her back, it was her fear. She had been betrayed by her own family, left to die without a second thought. Could she trust a human? Was he here to finish what her father had started? Ethan knelt beside her, careful not to let the cold seep into his suit any further. He checked her vitals. She was barely alive, her pulse weak, and her breathing shallow. The ship crash had damaged his equipment, but he still had some supplies left. He had no choice but to act quickly if he wanted to save her. He didn't care who she was or where she came from. He wasn't about to let anyone die in front of him. Zara could barely lift her head, but her eyes locked onto Ethan's, and for a brief moment, she saw something in his expression that made her hesitate. Was it pity? Compassion? In a world where survival meant betrayal and alliances were broken without hesitation, she hadn't expected kindness. But here, in the middle of the cold, desolate planet, this human soldier was showing her something she hadn't seen in years. Hope. "Stay with me," Ethan whispered, his voice low and firm. "I'm getting you out of here." Zara's mind raced. She could still feel the weight of her father's anger pressing down on her, the years of isolation and rebellion weighing heavily on her shoulders. But here, in this moment, the future seemed uncertain and unpredictable. She had no choice but to rely on this human stranger, and deep down, she realized it was her only hope. She closed her eyes, her body finally giving in to the exhaustion, as the warmth of Ethan's presence became the only thing keeping her alive. The wind howled around them, but in the face of such a vast, unyielding world, they were no longer alone. The cold exile had begun, but something had changed. A new chapter was starting, and Zara's fate was no longer sealed by the cruelty of her father or the icy planet she had been abandoned on. The real fight was just beginning. Zara's head throbbed with every heartbeat, and her body felt like it was made of ice. The cold had seeped deep into her bones, and every movement sent sharp pains through her limbs. But through the haze of her exhaustion, she felt something else, a warmth that wasn't the usual comforting heat of a fire, but something new, something human. Ethan had dragged her from the frozen wasteland and into the wreckage of his ship. It wasn't much, but it offered shelter from the deadly winds. His ship, though damaged and abandoned by his crew, was far from perfect. Its systems were failing, and its power core was barely functioning, but it was better than the deadly expanse outside. The inside smelled like metal and something else, but it was warm, and that was enough for Zara to cling to. As the minutes passed, Ethan worked quickly, using the emergency medical supplies from his suit. He knew the basics of first aid, but he had no real training for saving an alien princess. Yet he didn't hesitate. His instincts kicked in. He was a soldier, trained for survival, for combat, for situations like this. But nothing had prepared him for saving a life like hers. As he applied the cold compress to her bruised forehead, his mind raced. She was an alien after all. Not just any alien, but the daughter of the most powerful king in the galaxy. He knew her name, knew the stories of her defiance, her rebellion against her father's rule. The galaxy had whispered of her, painted her as a dangerous force who could one day turn the tide of war. But now, she was nothing more than a vulnerable young woman, lying unconscious in his arms, relying on him for her very survival. He couldn't help but wonder, how had someone so powerful been reduced to this? Zara's mind was clouded, swirling in a fog of pain and confusion. She had no idea how long she had been unconscious, but when she finally opened her eyes, the sight before her was almost too much to comprehend. Ethan sat next to her, looking down at a screen on his wrist. The faint glow illuminated his face, showing his sharp features and the determination in his eyes. His dark hair fell into his brow, and his clothes were marked with signs of wear. He looked like someone who had seen too much. And yet, he was here, a human. She had always been taught to view humans as inferior, primitive, weak, and easily manipulated. Her father had made sure to instill those beliefs into her mind. But lying there, in the warmth of his shelter, with her body slowly healing, those thoughts seemed distant. The cold wasn't just outside, it was inside her too. The isolation, the betrayal. For a moment, Zara thought about her father, King Vranok, the man who had given her everything, except love. Everything she had done in the name of rebellion had led to this moment. She had hoped for freedom, but now she was unsure of what that meant. Had she thrown away everything for nothing? "Hey." Ethan's voice broke through her thoughts. "How do you feel?" Zora blinked, Still dazed, she tried to speak, but her throat was dry, and the words didn't come. She opened her mouth again, but before she could say anything, Ethan stood up, his boots clicking against the floor of the ship. He moved to the small supply cabinet, pulling out a flask of water. The bottle seemed tiny in his hands, but Zara could feel the warmth radiating from it. He kneeled back down beside her and offered it to her lips. The cool liquid felt like heaven as it slid down her throat. "Slow down," Ethan said gently. "You've been through a lot." She didn't respond at first, just staring at him. A part of her didn't trust him, couldn't trust him. But another part of her, the part that was still human, wanted to believe. She was dying out there, alone and helpless. And yet this human, this stranger, had risked everything to save her. There was no logical reason for him to help her. After all, her kind had been enemies of his people for years. Yet here he was. Zara's eyes softened slightly as she studied him. The human soldier had a quiet confidence about him, a determination in his eyes that reminded her of someone she had once known. A leader, a warrior, someone who would never back down from a challenge. She realized she had misjudged them all. Not all humans were weak or cowardly. Some, like Ethan, had strength she couldn't deny. "I'm not your enemy," Ethan said, as if reading her thoughts. His voice was steady, calm, as if he had said those words 1,000 times before. "I'm just a soldier trying to survive, like you." Zara furrowed her brow. She had heard that line before, heard it from others who had tried to manipulate her, but somehow she didn't believe him. Maybe it was the way he looked at her, with nothing but concern in his eyes, or the way he treated her like a person, not an object, not a pawn. She didn't know yet if she could trust him completely, but she was beginning to realize that for the first time in a long while, she didn't have to be alone. "I don't understand," Zara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you helping me?" Ethan paused for a long moment. "Because you're human," he said, "and because it's the right thing to do." Zara looked at him, trying to find the meaning in his words. She had spent her whole life surrounded by manipulation, deceit, and power struggles. But here, in this strange and foreign moment, in the middle of nowhere, there was something different. Ethan wasn't asking for anything in return. He was helping her simply because it was right. And for the first time since her exile, Zara wondered if she could be more than just the rebellious daughter of a king. Could she, too, be something else? Something better? As the silence stretched between them, Zara finally let herself relax. Her body still ached, but her mind was no longer clouded with doubt. For once, she felt like there was hope, and in the midst of all the chaos, she wasn't alone anymore. Ethan stood up and moved toward the console, tapping a few buttons. "We need to figure out how to get off this planet. I can't stay here long, and neither can you." Zara nodded, her gaze fixed on the human who had unexpectedly become her ally. She didn't know what the future held, but for now, she had one chance to survive. And maybe, just maybe, to find the freedom she had always wanted. Zara sat quietly in the darkened corner of the ship, watching Ethan as he worked on the damaged communications system. The hum of machinery was a constant reminder of the danger they were in. The wrecked ship wasn't going to last much longer. But Zara couldn't focus on that right now. Her thoughts were with her father. The last words he had spoken to her before he had abandoned her on this frozen world echoed in her mind. "You are nothing but a failure, Zara," King Vrenok had said, his voice cold and harsh. "Your rebellion will be the end of you. You will die on this planet, forgotten and alone." She had left with rage in her heart, swearing she would prove him wrong. But now, as she sat there in the wreckage of a human ship, those words felt like a prophecy. What had she done? Had she really made the right choice to defy her father's rule? And what had she gained? Nothing but this cold exile, this unexpected alliance with a human. Ethan looked up from the console, his expression hardening. "We've got a problem," he said, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "I just received a transmission from the planet's orbiting satellite. They've located us. Zara's heart skipped a beat. She knew what that meant. Her father's wrath was not something to take lightly. King Vrenok ruled with an iron fist, and the thought of him sending his fleet after her sent a chill down her spine. The king would stop at nothing to find her, and make sure she never returned. And if she did return, it would be as a prisoner, a symbol of his victory over her rebellion. "You don't understand," Zara said, her voice trembling. "My father won't stop until I'm dead. He won't rest until he's erased every trace of my existence." Ethan's expression softened for a moment, but he didn't back down. "We're not just going to let that happen. You're not alone anymore, Zara. I'll fight with you." But Zara couldn't shake the weight of the situation. Her father was a powerful figure in the galaxy. His military was vast. His reach was far. He had fleets of ships at his command, thousands of soldiers, and technology far beyond what humans could dream of. The king had always been ruthless, and now he would unleash that wrath on the only person who had ever defied him, his own daughter. As the transmission came through on the console, the voice on the other end sent a wave of dread through Zara's chest. It was her father's right-hand general, a man named Kroos. His voice was cold, filled with the same harshness Zara had known all her life. "Princess Zara, you cannot run from your fate. Your father has sent his fleets to ensure your punishment. Surrender now, and you may still have a chance to return to the palace. Resist, and you will suffer the consequences." Zara's grip tightened on the seat beneath her, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had always known this moment would come, but it didn't make it any easier to face. The king's wrath was legendary, and now it was aimed directly at her. There would be no mercy, no second chances. If she was captured, she would be subjected to torture, humiliation, and worse. Her father would make an example of her. "I'm not going back," Zara said through gritted teeth. "I'll never go back to him." Ethan nodded, his jaw set in determination. "Then we run. We fight. We survive." Zara turned her eyes to the sky, staring out through the cracked viewport of the ship. The cold winds howled outside, but she could feel something inside her growing warmer. The fire of rebellion that had once burned so brightly inside her chest was reigniting. She wasn't going to let her father win. Not like this. Not when she had a chance to rewrite her own destiny. But she knew it wasn't going to be easy. Her father's forces were already on their way. Kroos had warned them. And Zara could almost feel the weight of the king's gaze pressing down on her. There was no escaping the truth. She had made an enemy of the most powerful ruler in the galaxy, and he wasn't going to let that go. Zara stood up, a sense of resolve settling over her. "We need to leave now. There's no time to waste. If we stay here much longer, my father's fleet will catch us." Ethan hesitated, his fingers hovering over the control panel. "The ship's not in good shape. We'll never make it off this planet without help." Zara's mind raced. She knew he was right. The ship had been damaged in the crash, and its systems were barely functional. But there had to be a way. They couldn't just wait to die here, on this cold, desolate planet. The king's wrath would be swift, but they could still escape. They had to. "Is there anything on this planet we can use? Any way to contact someone? A ship? Anything?" Zara asked, her voice desperate. Ethan thought for a moment before shaking his head. "I don't know. But we have one option. There's an old military outpost not far from here. If it's still intact, it might have the equipment we need to make a run for it." Zara's heart pounded in her chest. It was a long shot, but it was their only shot. "Then that's where we're going. We can't wait any longer. We have to get there before my father does." As they prepared to leave the wreckage of the ship behind, Zara couldn't help but feel the weight of her father's wrath hanging over her. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Her father would stop at nothing to destroy her, to make sure she never threatened his rule again. But Zara wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not when she had a chance to fight back, to prove that she could be more than just the rebellious daughter of a king. With Ethan by her side, Zara felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in years. She wasn't alone. And that, she realized, made all the difference. Together, they would face whatever came next, and they would survive. The journey to the military outpost was grueling. The cold winds howled around Zara and Ethan as they trudged through the icy plains, their every breath visible in the frigid air. The landscape around them was barren and unforgiving, stretching out for miles in all directions. Zara couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Her father's fleet was closing in, and they had no time to waste. They had to find the outpost, fix the ship, and escape before it was too late. Ethan had taken the lead, scanning the horizon for any signs of the outpost. Zara followed closely behind, her thoughts heavy with worry. The longer they walked, the more exhausted she became. She was no stranger to hardship, but the strain of surviving alone on this frozen planet, combined with the fear of her father's wrath, was taking its toll. "We're getting closer," Ethan said, his voice barely audible above the howling wind. "Just a little further." Zara nodded, trying to focus on the task at hand. She couldn't afford to let herself be distracted. But as they moved forward, something felt off. The wind seemed to carry a different sound now, a faint whine that seemed to grow louder with each step. Zara's heart began to race. She had learned to trust her instincts, and right now, her instincts were telling her that something was wrong. Without warning, Ethan suddenly dropped to one knee, his hand gripping his side. Zara froze, her heart leaping into her throat. "Ethan," she called, rushing to his side. He looked up at her, his face pale and strained. "It's nothing. Just a little pain," he said, his voice weak. But Zara wasn't fooled. Something was wrong. "Ethan, what's going on? You need to tell me." He hesitated, his eyes darting around the desolate landscape as if searching for something. "Zara, I didn't want to tell you, but we're not alone." Before Zara could respond, the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow reached her ears. She turned just in time to see a group of soldiers emerging from behind a nearby ridge. Their uniforms were marked with the symbol of the royal fleet, her father's fleet. Zara's blood ran cold. It was a trap. "Ethan, no," she cried, stepping back. You betrayed me." Ethan's face twisted in pain as he struggled to stand. "I never meant for this to happen," he said, his voice shaking. "I swear, I didn't know they'd be following us. But they promised me." Zara's mind raced, trying to process what was happening. Betrayal. The one person she had trusted. Had he sold her out? No, it didn't make sense. Ethan had fought alongside her, helped her escape. He couldn't have known. But then, why were they here? Why were they waiting for her? The soldiers advanced, their weapons raised. "Princess Zara, you are under arrest by the command of King Vrenok," one of them called, his voice gruff. "You will come with us, peacefully. If you resist, we will use force." Zara's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't go back. She couldn't let them take her. But what choice did she have? She was outnumbered, and the soldiers were armed with advanced technology. She had nothing to fight with. Ethan staggered to his feet, his face twisted with regret. "Zara, I didn't want this. Please, just come with them. It's the only way." Her eyes burned with tears, but she refused to let them fall. Betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. Ethan, the one person she thought she could trust, had been working with her father's soldiers all along. And now, there was no escape. But Zara was not a princess who would bow to defeat. Her father had thought he could break her, but he had underestimated her. She would not let this betrayal be her end. With a swift motion, Zara turned on her heel and bolted into the storm. She didn't care where she was going. She just needed to get away, to buy herself some time. Her breath came in sharp gasps as she ran, the cold biting into her skin, the snow whipping around her. The soldiers called after her, but she didn't look back. She ran for what felt like an eternity, her legs burning, her mind racing. She had to find a way out, a way to survive. The military outpost was still miles away, but she couldn't give up now. She couldn't let them win. Suddenly, she heard the familiar sound of a ship's engine in the distance. A beam of light shot through the storm, and Zara's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't one of her father's ships. It was a human ship. She didn't hesitate. Zara dashed towards the light, her eyes narrowing as she saw the shape of a ship rising above the horizon. She knew this was her only chance. If she could reach it, she could escape. She could survive. The soldiers were closing in behind her, but Zara wasn't about to let them catch her now. She pushed herself harder, faster, her breath coming in ragged bursts as the human ship came into focus. She was so close, she could almost taste freedom. The ship landed just ahead, its engines powering down with a low hum. Zara didn't know who was on board, but she didn't care. She had to trust someone, and this was her only option. As she reached the ship, the hatch opened, and a figure stepped out. Zara's heart stopped when she saw who it was. It was Ethan, but this time, his expression was different. There was no hesitation in his eyes, no regret, just cold determination. "I'm sorry, Zara," he said, his voice low, "but I had to make a choice, and I chose survival." Before Zara could react, he grabbed her arm and pulled her inside the ship, slamming the hatch shut behind them. The engines roared to life, and Zara was thrown against the wall as the ship shot into the sky, leaving the soldiers behind. Betrayal, survival, both were now in her past. The future, however, was uncertain, and as the ship soared into the unknown, Zara could only wonder what awaited her next. The ship was quiet, except for the hum of its engines and the sound of Zara's heart pounding in her chest. The betrayal by Ethan had cut deep, but now there was no time to dwell on the past. She had to focus on the present, on the mission that had brought her here. Her father's fleet would be hunting her, and she needed a plan to escape. Ethan sat at the controls, his back turned to her as he piloted the ship through the harsh atmosphere. Zara stood at the back, staring out of the viewport at the stars. The cold emptiness of space was a stark contrast to the chaos she felt inside. It had been hours since they had left the icy planet, but the tension between them remained thick. "You can't run forever, you know," Zara said, breaking the silence. Her voice was colder than she intended, but she couldn't hide the anger that had built up inside her. Ethan had betrayed her, and now he was flying her into the unknown. He had made his choice, but so had she. "I know," Ethan replied quietly, his voice tight. "But there's no going back for either of us. You have to trust me now." Zara turned to him, disbelief in her eyes. "Trust you? After everything you've done?" Ethan clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening on the controls. "You have no choice. If we don't work together, we both die. Your father's fleet won't stop until we're both dead." Her heart sank at his words. The reality of the situation was starting to set in. Her father, the mighty King Vrenok, was relentless. His power was absolute, and no one defied him. If she didn't act fast, she'd be trapped between her father's wrath and the danger of a galaxy that viewed her as nothing more than a traitor. The only hope for survival was finding a way to defeat him, but Zara knew she couldn't do it alone. "We need to find allies," Zara said, her mind racing. "People who will help us fight back." Ethan looked at her for the first time since they had taken off. His eyes were full of regret, but also something else, determination. "You think I don't know that? We've been running, Zara, but there's no place to hide. The only place we can fight is the one your father least expects. The human outpost." Zara frowned. The human outpost. Why would they help us? Ethan's lips curved into a wry smile. "They won't help us unless we give them a reason. But I know how to make them listen." The plan was risky. In fact, it felt like suicide, but Zara was desperate. She couldn't afford to let her father win. She had to fight back, not just for her own survival, but for the future of her people. Her thoughts turned to the rebellion she had once heard whispers of, the underground movement that opposed her father's rule. Maybe they were still out there, waiting for a chance to strike. If she could find them, they might stand a chance. But the clock was ticking, and every second brought her closer to being caught. As the ship flew toward the outpost, Zora's mind raced. She knew the risks, knew how dangerous it was to trust anyone in this galaxy. But she also knew that if she didn't take this chance, there would be no more opportunities. Ethan's betrayal had pushed her to her breaking point. But in that moment, she realized that she was stronger than she had ever been before. She had no choice but to fight. The ship finally arrived at the human outpost, its silhouette appearing in the distance. Zara's breath caught in her throat. This was it, the final confrontation. She was about to face everything she had been running from. And the stakes had never been higher. The ship touched down on the icy surface of the outpost, and Zara stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do next. Ethan's hand was steady on the controls, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. They both knew the danger they were in. "Stay close to me," Ethan said, his voice low. "We don't know who we can trust here. If things go wrong, we fight our way out." Zara nodded, her heart racing. As the hatch opened, they were greeted by a group of soldiers, human soldiers, but armed and prepared for battle. Zara's eyes scanned the area quickly, noting the hardened expressions of the soldiers, their weapons at the ready. They were not the welcoming party she had hoped for. "You'll have to come with us," one of the soldiers said, his voice cold and firm. Zara stepped forward, her hands raised in a peaceful gesture. "I'm Zara Vrenok, Princess of the Vrenok Empire," she said, trying to sound confident, though her heart was pounding in her chest. "I've come to ask for your help. My father's fleet is after me. I need sanctuary. We need sanctuary." The soldier glanced at Ethan, his expression skeptical. "And why should we trust you?" Ethan stepped forward. "Because if we don't, the entire galaxy will burn under her father's rule. And if you want to survive, you'll need to make a choice." The tension in the air was thick. Zara could feel the weight of every eye on her, and she knew that one wrong move could cost them everything. The human soldiers didn't trust her, and they had every reason not to. After all, she was the daughter of a king known for his ruthlessness. But she had no other choice. She had to make them see that she was different, that she was willing to fight for a future where they could all live without fear. The soldier who had spoken stepped forward, his face hard. "You have 5 minutes to convince us," he said. "If you don't, we're handing you over to your father's fleet. And believe me, you don't want that." Zara's heart pounded. The final confrontation had begun. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Zara stood before the human soldiers, her heart racing as she awaited their decision. Her fate, and possibly the fate of the galaxy, hung in the balance. She could see the skepticism in their eyes, their fingers hovering over their weapons, ready for any sign of aggression. Ethan stood beside her, his expression unreadable, but Zara could feel the weight of his gaze. He had put everything on the line for this moment, just as she had. "You've got 5 minutes," the soldier repeated, his voice cold and firm. "Convince us, or you're dead." Zara's mind raced, trying to come up with the right words. She had always been taught to wield power, to demand respect. But now, in the face of potential death, all she had was the truth. Her father's ruthless empire, the Vrenok dynasty, had no place for mercy, no room for compassion. Zara had learned it the hard way. But in this moment, she wasn't just the daughter of a king. She was a woman who had seen the destruction caused by her father's ambitions. She had seen the lives lost, the planets ravaged, and the innocents caught in the crossfire. And now she had to convince these strangers, these soldiers, that she was worth trusting. "I don't want to be my father's heir," Zara said, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her. "I don't want to rule over a galaxy built on oppression and fear. I'm running because I want a different future, one where people like you, people who fight for freedom, have a place to live without fear of the Vrenok dynasty." There was a moment of silence, and Zora could feel the weight of the soldiers' stares. She had said it all, every word spoken from the heart. But was it enough? Would they believe her? Ethan stepped forward, his voice calm but forceful. I can vouch for her. I've seen what she's willing to sacrifice. Her father will stop at nothing to crush us. If we don't stand together, we all fall. But if you help us, we can fight back. We can give you a chance to make a real difference. The soldiers exchanged looks, their hardened expressions softening for a brief moment. Zora's eyes darted between them, hoping that they saw the truth in her words. She could hear the sound of footsteps approaching, and a tall, older man stepped forward, his uniform a bit more ornate than the others. His eyes studied Zora for a long moment before he spoke. You're a royal, the daughter of a king who controls fleets of ships, who rules with an iron fist, the man said, his voice rough but not unkind. Why should we believe you? Why should we risk our lives for a rebel princess? Zora took a deep breath. She had been called many things, entitled, ruthless, cold. But in that moment, she had to convince him that she was more than her title, more than the blood that ran through her veins. Because I'm not asking you to risk your lives for me, Zora said, her eyes meeting his. I'm asking you to risk everything for the future, for the people who can't fight back against my father's tyranny. I'm asking you to stand with me to build a future where we don't have to live in fear of him anymore. The older man's gaze softened, and he nodded slowly. You've got guts, princess. I'll give you that. He motioned to the other soldiers, signaling them to lower their weapons. All right, we'll give you a chance, but you better not be lying, because if you are, we'll make sure you regret it. Zora's heart surged with a mix of relief and gratitude. She had done it. She had convinced them. But the battle was far from over. There were still too many obstacles standing in her way. Her father's army, the vast network of spies, and the treacherous world she now found herself in. But for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. They were alive. They were free. And they had allies. Ethan gave her a small smile, his eyes betraying his relief. We've got a lot of work ahead of us, but we're not alone anymore. Zora nodded, feeling a sense of unity between them. They were no longer enemies, no longer prisoners of circumstance. They were allies, and together they would take down her father's empire. The soldiers led them into the heart of the human outpost, a sprawling base filled with activity. Engineers worked on ships, soldiers practiced combat drills, and a sense of purpose hung in the air. Zora felt the weight of her responsibility settle on her shoulders. She had come here looking for sanctuary, but now she had found something far more valuable, an army, a force that could help her take on her father's empire. As the day wore on, Zora and Ethan met with the leaders of the outpost, making plans, forging alliances, and setting their sights on a future that was no longer defined by the Vernok dynasty. For the first time, Zora felt like she had a real chance to change things. She wasn't just the daughter of a king. She was a warrior, a leader, and someone who would stop at nothing to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. As night fell, Zora stood on the balcony of the outpost, staring out at the stars. The vastness of space had always seemed so cold and indifferent, but tonight it felt different. Tonight, she wasn't alone. Tonight, she had hope. The dawn of a new era was on the horizon, and Zora was ready to fight for it. The path ahead would be long and dangerous, but for the first time in her life, Zora knew she wasn't running anymore. She was fighting, and she was ready to win.